Hello and welcome to this quick and small tutorial where I want to show how we can use SvelteKit and combine it with SQLite to make powerful, small, self-contained database applications. So I used this sample database called Chinook, and it has basically tracks, albums, and artists. At least that's what I used in this app, and you can download it from here. And we build a small SvelteKit app with it. So the result is this here. So we have a base page where we have some tracks, and we can actually search here, and we also get a link to an album. So we will be redirected to a small details page, and we can also update information here. So this album name is now changed. So if you're interested in finding out how it's done, please check this tutorial out and have fun. Okay, our first step is to create a new SvelteKit project. I've opened the SvelteKit documentation. You can visit it yourself on kitsvelte.dev. And under creating project, we get this command here, npm create svelte at latest my app, and this actually creates a new SvelteKit project. So let's do it. I'm here in a folder where I want it to be. Paste that command, and I'm changing the name to SvelteKit SQLite music app, and it's gonna ask us some questions. For example, which template we're gonna use. The first one is a demo app with a few pages already created. I'm not going to use that. Instead, I'm going to use a skeleton project because we want to add our own roads, and we start with the minimum or the minimal setup. So I'm going to press enter on this one, and I'm going to use TypeScript, and I'm going to use ESLint and Prettier for code linting and code formatting. We don't need tests for this demo, so I'm gonna choose no for Playwright and also no for vtest. So we created our project. What we're gonna do now is we can open this with Visual Studio Code. So SvelteKit SQLite music app, and we get a new window. And the first thing we're gonna do here is we gonna do an npm install, and that's gonna take some time, so I'll be back when it's done. Okay, it's installed now, and to see if it works, we can just enter npm run dev to start our SvelteKit server in dev mode, and it's gonna give us this URL with this port. I already opened it, and yeah, we can see we are on a sample starting page. Okay, great. So let's move on with setting up the database connection to our SQLite file. First off, we need to actually place the database file in here. So I'm gonna create a folder called data, and I'm gonna copy this Chinook file into this data directory, and with this file we can then query the data. And to access this file, we actually need to install some SQLite handler for Node.js, and I'm gonna use Better SQLite 3. There are other ones, you can try out other ones, but I like to use this one. And notice that I switched to Yarn because I had a problem with my Mac, ARM Mac, that installed some different versions for ESBuild. If you have the same problem, you may want to check out this solution here. But notice I'm gonna install it with the Yarn now, and you can basically do the same with npm. So yarn add better SQLite 3, install that, and we also need the types of this package. Add types, slash better SQLite 3. Great, now we're set up so we can start integrating the database. So let's again start the dev server, yarn dev or npm run dev, whatever you're using, and great, it's starting. So we need to set up our database connection. We do that in SvelteKit, not anywhere here in the routes folder where we define our application or our front end. We have a dedicated lib folder we can use. So let's create it, lib. And in there we can do all the shared stuff that's not front end related, or you can also put some components in here, basically anything that's not directly sitting in a route. So let's go ahead here. We can add a subfolder server. So stuff in here is only accessible for the server, the backend, so not the front end. That's what we want. And we can also create a DB folder in here. In there, I'm gonna create an index file, index.ts, where we then can go ahead and start using or setting up the database. So I'm gonna import database from better SQLite 3, great, and I'm gonna initiate a database with new database. Gonna put in the path, so path is /data/chinook.db, and we can also log everything to the console so we can see if it works. This should be turned off in production, but I'm just using it for now. Another thing is we hard-coded this path here, but if we want to later deploy to production, maybe we don't want to put it in the same path in here, maybe in a different path. We can do that simply by making it configurable in an env file. So I'm gonna create a .env file, and in here I'm gonna put a variable with db path, and we can change that then in the deployment in the production environment. So instead of hard coding it also here, we need to change it. And for that, Svelte is also a nice way to import env variables. So I'm gonna import db path. Great thing, it's also typed, so we can import it, but it doesn't actually bring this env stuff. I don't know if it's needed, but I used it all the time. So let's add this env part before it. And then we're gonna use that variable in the new database part. Okay, great. So we have already set up our database connection. Thing is, we need to query some data actually. So to do that, I'm gonna open the database overlay. So this is a Beekeeper Studio. It's a free tool where you can handle a lot of databases. I recommend you to check it out. And we're gonna, on the first page, on the main page, we're gonna show some tracks we have. So let's first start with select star from tracks, and we get everything we know, everything that the table holds here. So we want to show artist info, album info for each track. So let's actually write a better query. So I'm gonna start with the fields we only want. So track ID. I also always alias the columns, so we can, it's like in a format we want to use in JavaScript. So camel case is this, I guess. So in JavaScript we can just handle it easier, or like we're used to. And next one, name is track name. Great. And I think we also want to join the albums. So it has an album ID and a table albums, so we can join albums A on t.albumid equals a.albumid, and then we can also put the a album ID as album ID, and also the name title as album title. So I'm gonna add a few more columns to the statement and fast forward this. So see you soon. So the query is done now. We get more info and yeah, track, album, title, artist name, and genre. And I think what we also want to do is limit how many rows we get, because we don't, I think there are thousands of tracks in this database and it may grow. So you don't want to load every track for each user. So let's maybe limit it and only show the first 450. And so yeah, the user doesn't need to load too much data. Great, so we have our query now, and I'm going to copy it, and we can actually do a function in our database files to query this data. Export function get initial tracks, I call this function, and there I'm going to first off put the SQL statement. So this is our query, and with that we can make a statement db prepare SQL to get the rows. We can do statement.all and in the end we return the rows. Great. So one thing is that we currently are not really using TypeScript, so we return anything. So let's add a type for it. So I'm gonna create a types file for the database, and I already created it. I'm just gonna paste it. So we export type track, and here are all the fields, all the columns specified with that type. And in this file we can then say as track, need to import that type, and this returns this track. And another thing is maybe we want to make this limit configurable. So let's actually add a variable to it. So let's say $limit and pass it as an argument limit and default it to 50. And then we can actually in the statement.all section pass the variable, so it will get replaced in the actual query. So yeah, our function to query the data is now set. So we now want to actually show this data on this page. So let's go ahead and this is the main file in the routes, the main route page.svelte. This is the markup, the Svelte markup for this file. And we want to show the data in here. So what we want to do is to load the data on the server and just output it to the page. For that we're going to create a new file here, and it's page.server.ts, and in this server file the stuff gets executed on the server to enrich the page with some data. So in this we have a load function, const load, and in there we actually have to say satisfies page load, page server load. So Svelte knows that this function needs to run before the page is loaded actually. And we can just get the tracks data. So tracks is equals to get initial tracks, Thank you. Import it, and we then return our data tracks. So that's all we needed to do here. We just say to Svelte, okay, to render this page, we need to load data on the server. That's why it's called ServerTS. Can also quickly look at the documentation. So here's the section loading data, and here's is also explained here. You can also create a page.ts and a page server.ts where you can decide, okay, this first one loads on the client. If you fetch a public API, you don't need to do this on the server, but because our database connection is from the server or on the server, we need to actually do it on the server, the page loading. So check out the docs if you want to know more, and let's go back. So now we've actually loaded the data, we need to implement it into the page. So for that, we're gonna add a script here, script language TS, and we can then import a type from Svelte that's called page data, and it's cool that Svelte automatically types what we export here, so we can import that type and we get the data from this data variable. So let's make a small pre and in there a code, and we could display all the data, but we actually here we return this object. We actually only want the tracks in here, so we can say dot tracks, and it actually, you can see here, it knows its type. So let's go back to the file, to the page, and it's already reloaded, and we see the JSON of our queried data, exactly 50 rows. So this works fine. Great. So let's make this page look a little bit more beautiful and actually have some layout that's not JSON. And for that, I'm gonna, because I don't want to spend too much time on it, I'm gonna use Bulma. Bulma is a small CSS framework, and it's very opinionated, so it has default styles for almost everything and helps make everything, makes CSS a lot simpler. So to do that, I'm quickly just gonna input or add a style sheet from a CDN. So here CDN JSDeliver, and I'm just gonna go Bulma the file, and if we reload, we can already see it looks a little bit different here. And so let's change the content here. First off, this is the tracks page, so h1 tracks, and let's delete this section here and make the heading actually look big. So class is size 1, that's one of the classes Bulma has to make text big. And let's also get rid of this code stuff and add an actual table. So in Bulma we can then add the class table to style it, and we go ahead, make a table header, make a table row, and we're gonna display these 4 columns: track, artist, album, genre. Great. And for the data, we add a tbody. And now we're gonna loop through all the tracks we imported. And you can see already TypeScript does work. Copilot auto-generated some code for me, but it got the names mixed up, so we can actually fix it with our typing. So we first want the track name, then we want the artist name, and then we want the album name. No, album title, and is right. So if I refresh the page, we actually get a nice table here. And yeah, it's maybe a little bit stretched to the left. We want some padding. So let's wrap this in a div. Yes. And in the div add a class, it's px4. So there's a little space to the left. Okay, this looks good enough for me. And the next step is to create a page for the albums. So if we have a link here, we can click on the album and maybe get a small overview on this album. So let's jump back into the code and see what we can do. So on this component here, we have our table, and here's the album title. So let's actually create an href so we can link to the album. And the link will be, let's say we add a subroute album, and then we actually add an ID. So let's make it dynamic with a string template. So slash, and then we're gonna pass the track.album ID as parameter. So we will just link to a noun route endpoint. So if we go back to it, yeah, we will get an error because we actually haven't defined this route, and it sends back a default 404 page. And to define the route, we create just a new folder in this routes folder, and we call it first album. So that's this part, but this is still not enough. We have another slash and another sub route here. So this is dynamic because the album ID can be anything. So we can do it with the squared brackets, and we're gonna give it a name called, in this case, album ID. And here, what we can do here is page.svelte and just return any album for now. So let's go back, and we can see here we have an any album page, and no matter what album we click, we get to this page. So yeah, that's good enough for now, but we actually want to show the real data of the album. So first off, we need to again create some queries. And so for the first one, we want to get the album data for our album ID. And for that, I'm going to create a new function, export function, get album by ID. And we're going to pass an album ID of the type number. Number. Okay. So we again need an SQL statement. I prepared something for this. So gonna select the album ID, title, and artist information. From albums, join the artists table, and we're gonna do a where on the album ID. And again, we can create a statement like above, db prepare SQL, and we get the row, not statement.all, but statement.get, and we pass the album ID. So it gets replaced in the query, and we don't get any injection vulnerabilities. So return row as album. We haven't created that type yet, so let's go back to our types, and here is our album type. So still need to import it, and voila. I also add another function. We also want to show the tracks for the album. For that, I also prepared something. So we select the track ID, track name, track milliseconds, again from the album, and we order by track ID. Again, another type is needed, so let's add that too, album track, and gonna import it here. So we now have two functions, get album ID and get album tracks. And we can go back to our album route and create again a page.server.ts. This is the same procedure as before. We export a load function, load equals, and it satisfies page server load. What did I do wrong? I think I need to put this also in a bracket. Yes, great. So we first need to know which album to fetch. So we need the album ID from the path, from the URL path. So we get that by adding a parameter to this function. We get that from Svelte called params, and we get our album ID just by getting params.albumID. So because we named it this way in our squared brackets, we get it also typed. And if you look at the type, we see that's actually a string. That makes sense because URLs don't know any types, it's just characters. And so we need to do a parse int here. So we get it as an integer or number in TypeScript. So we get our album data by using our function we created, get album by ID, and we get our tracks with get album tracks, and we're gonna return both. So great. Again, we need to actually show this data. So same procedure as before. We create our little script tag here, import our page data type, and export the data let. So we get the data in this variable. Also again, greatly typed. And to show the header, we can do now is we can go ahead and make get data.album.album title, and let's add the class so it's actually a nice big header. Go back and we have big ones, checked little pill. So we now load the correct data. Can go do a little bit more. So let's again add a div with a padding to the sides. So let's do this and maybe add a little paragraph that shows the artist. So we say by artist name, and again add a small table that shows the tracks. So in here I also get from an each loop this iterator, so I can show the track number, and for the track milliseconds I floor them after dividing by 1000 to get seconds. So let's see how it looks, and we get this beautiful page, an album by AC/DC, and we get a track list. Okay, great. So what happens if we now do something here that doesn't exist? Oh, we get an internal server error. That's pretty bad. So what happens here? We actually go back to the server file. So what we do here is we get the album ID, we pass the int. What I did here is I entered just text. So after parsing this as an integer, we get nothing because it has no numbers in the text, and we still pass that to the function that queries the database. And we can see here, because we trace our database log, that we query with where album ID is null, and of course that doesn't return anything, and that's bad. So what we can do to mitigate this error is we can make a small check here. If not album ID, then we can actually throw a Svelte error. So it's an own class, so it's lowercase. So we import error from Svelte and we put our HTTP code 404 from not found and also the text album not found. So we now get this page, we get a 404 status code and some info. Okay, so what happens if we put an album here that doesn't exist in the database but is still a number? We get again an internal server error. That's also not what we want. So again, we query the database and we actually use the correct number, but database doesn't find anything. So let's maybe just check here if there is no album returned from this. Again, throw error, album not found. Great. So what we can do additionally is we can customize how this error page looks. So we can do this also per route base. So I can go ahead in my folder and create an plus error.svelte page. And in there, we can first import this from app stores. We get the page info in there. And then we can do our own markup. So I'm going to create a h1, whoopsie whoopsie, and put in there page.status. That's the number, the status number, and page error message. We can then show what message we have put in there. So basically these two infos. And if we go to our page, we see now, okay, it's our custom page with this oopsie whoopsie header. So we can define specific error pages to our page. Okay, so let's go back to an album that actually exists. And okay, the next thing we're gonna do is find out how we can maybe update our database table and change the name of our album. So to do this, we start off by again going to our database file and in there adding a new function that actually does the update. So again, I prepared something, create this function, update album title, and I'm gonna pass the album ID and the title, the new one. We have this simple SQL statement that updates the column, and we just run it. And yeah, to call it, we must go to our page and just add a little section that actually executes the statement or that allows us to execute it. So we're gonna add a little section here, so a small h2 update album name, and in there we're gonna put a form. So this one, gonna say it's gonna use post as a method. You could also use get, but I like to use post. And in there we're gonna put an input and gonna give it the class input, so it's styled. Gonna give it a type text, name is album title. We default the value from our data, so from the same we put up here in the title, so we put the album title in there already. And let's also give it a max width of 50 characters. Yeah. And we also need a button. So class is button and is primary, and type is submit. We want to submit the form, and we call it update. So let's take a quick look, and yeah, this looks great and works. So Svelte helps us doing this in a good way. So we can actually give this action a specific name, so we can then handle this action. I'm gonna give it a form action name, start off with a question and then a slash, because we want to stay in the same path, so it's just a query parameter in the URL, not a subpath. And we call it update album title. So when we submit this form, we're gonna get the form data, so this album title, but we still also want the ID, so we know which one we can update. So I'm gonna add an input with type hidden for the album ID. We don't see it on the page, but it gets also submitted, so we can just get these two values, the title and the ID, and with that we can actually do the SQL statement we created. So let's take again a look, and yeah, from this point nothing looks changed. So now we have to add this form action here to our server TS, and for this we gonna create a new or export a new variable. It's called const actions, and it gets the type actions from SvelteKit. And in here we just put our name we defined for the button, and we get a request in there, and this function then executes our update. So let's get the data we submit in the form. Can wait request dot form data. This is of the type form data, and to actually get the information from there we can use the get function, and from it we also call toString. But this is actually we actually want this again passed as an integer, so I just go it again. So if this is not empty, so we say album ID string, then we pass it, otherwise we put it to null. And the album title is a string, so we can just go do the toString part, data get album title and then toString. Then we can do a quick check, so if not album ID and album title, so we need both data to actually do our update statement. Neither can be empty, or at least we don't want to allow the user to update an album to an empty name. So we can say album ID or album title missing, and in the end, if we pass through that section here, we can call our database function. So again, we created this form with the method post. We put our two inputs in there, the two values we need for our statement. We put a button in here, type is submit, and we add this form action attribute with the question mark slash and then the name of the action we want to call. So what I could also do is duplicate it and make a delete action, delete album, and then in here put another method here, delete album. But for this example that's enough, so gonna remove it again, and let's see if it works. So I go back to our page. We are on the album for the rock we set it to, and I'm just gonna add ABC on the end. I press update, and you can see it's already reloaded quickly. And if we go back, we actually load the main page. You can see here the name is updated, and we can change it back again. If we look at the code, on the logs from the database, we actually see here update album set title, where album ID equals 1. And to finish off this tutorial, I want to show you how we can make a search for this tracks page that listens to changes and basically if when you type it filters the data shown here. And so for that we need to create a SvelteKit API. So let's do this. First up, so we want to filter the tracks, so let's make a quick database function for it. So search track and add search term string as a type, as a parameter. And for that we need to add a where clause. So where t name like search term, but that's not enough. We also want to lowercase both the terms, and we want to search anywhere in the text, so we add %signs. So it says basically allow anything after and before the search term. Yeah. And so this is our function, and we need to still pass the search term. So let's quickly add a search inbox here, and for that we need to go to the basic page. So this is the tracks section here, and for that gonna add some margin below. And here I'm gonna do a small input, type search, so we get that little X to delete our phrase. Placeholder is search, and class is input, so it's styled. Also add some margin below that. Style, let's do max width of 80 characters, and let's create a value that stores it. Search term, and let's say value equals search term. And now let's have a look at the result. Okay. Now we need to create the API that actually handles the request, where we want to fetch our search tracks from the database. So for this we can create a Svelte API, and that's basically a server function that's not sitting inside a page, that's sitting alone. So for that we're going to create a subfolder in our routes called API. In there we add another folder called search track. That's our API endpoint. Here we don't make it .page.server.ts, just a .server.ts, because again there's no page in this endpoint, it's just this single endpoint. And yeah, what we do here is we fetch the data. So to do that we're gonna export a const, and this must be named like the HTTP function we want to provide. So I think our use case get suits us, because we want to basically just query or get the tracks behind the search term. So let's do that, and we get our URL in here, and we then say here satisfies request handler. So I think it's the best to pass the search term as a URL parameter. So we can get from the URL search params, get search term. Yeah, we basically get from the search parameters the named one called search term. And again, we can stringify this. We want to return tracks. So we type them of our database type track and initiate an empty array. So when we find nothing, we want to return an empty array instead of an error, because we can show that there are no results. So if there isn't a search term passed, for example, if the search is cleared after a search was done, we want to get the initial tracks. That's the same that are currently loaded on initial page load. And otherwise, if we have a search term, we can then load our function. Did I name it search tracks? Let's find out. No. How did I name it? Search track. I did export it. Search tracks. Yeah, I think it should be called search tracks, because it returns an array. So now we get our tracks. And maybe if this doesn't return anything because it doesn't find anything, let's default it with an empty array. And we can then return and call the SvelteKit JSON function and just pass the tracks. So now we have an API endpoint. We can call it with /search track and then pass an URL parameter with search term. I guess we should also rename this search tracks. Would make sense, I guess. So let's go back to our main page. And what we can do here now, we're gonna add a little event handler basically on key up. So right after we type, we can make a handle search function. So this handle search function, it receive an event search event, and we basically want to get the target of this event, and we type it as an input element, so we have a value from it, and we can then set our search term to target.value. Because we type there fast, so we don't want to actually trigger millions of requests here while we type, we're gonna debounce it a little bit. So let's create a small timeout here. So timer equals Node.js timeout. First, if we enter this function, we're gonna clear the timeout. So if there's still one running, we cancel it. And we set a new one, set timeout. And we're gonna put these two rows in there. And let's say we debounce in, let's say, 300 milliseconds. So now we need to make our actual request to the API. So let's fetch tracks, make a function for it, and we can then just use fetch from the browser. We can basically do a REST request here. So let's go to /API, then we go to search tracks, and we pass our search term as a parameter, and then we want to pipe that result to the JSON function, and then we get the data. We can console log it first. So we now need to call this function. So let's head back. We have our search here, and let's open the DevTools console, and let's do child, and here you can see nothing. You can see still doesn't work. We don't get any child results. Why is that? Do we actually pass the search term? Yeah, we pass it child. So let's head back to our get function. Search term, maybe we can log it. Search term. Again, child. Search term is undefined. Why is that? Haha, I missed an error, I guess. Thanks, Copilot, I guess it was you. So let's find out if this does not work. We actually get an error. It's not better. Search tracks is not a function. I actually didn't save this file. Okay. Let's try again. Child. Yeah, this works. Payload, preview. We get only 21 results, and I think there's always a child in there. So that's good. This indeed works. So we still need to update the table here. And to do that, we need to actually go to the page. And so currently we go directly on data.tracks, but let's make a new variable called tracks, and on page load we set let tracks equals data.tracks, but here where we currently log it, we instead go tracks equals to data. So here we just get a flat array, so we don't need to do data.tracks. So we update the variable where the each loop is based upon. So again, we go to tracks, enter child, and we update here this table. Oops, that's not what I wanted. And I can cancel this. It actually doesn't. The X button doesn't is not a key up. So that should be handled as well. But for now, this search works great. So I guess this is the end of the tutorial. I hope you learned enough to build your own SvelteKit apps. If you have any feedback, any suggestions, please let me know in the comments. And thanks for viewing this. Have a nice day.